Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Today's lecture is going to be mostly on Islamophobia and the way this has become more prominent since 9/11, the war on terror, the idea of the clash of civilization, and also the development of Islamophobia specifically in the Netherlands, and the political developments of a new far-right discourse and normalization of racism in the Netherlands, also since the 9/11 era, and the populism coming up therein. Also, we will be talking in the end section a bit about intersectionality, the concept, but also how it relates to Islamophobia and groups in inside the Netherlands organizing in an intersectional way. So I hope you enjoyed today. So one of the readings or the watch list that you had to watch this week was a small compilation fragment video about a research of Dr. Shaheen in his research called Real Bad Arabs, where he basically researched the way in political Hollywood movies Muslims were being portrayed. And what he found was that between the films that were made by Hollywood between 1896 and the year 2000, which were around 1,000 films, only 12 of them portrayed Muslims positively. So that's like, less than 1% or something. It's really bad. And if you see the fragments, you can see the way in which Muslims were portrayed. And he also analyzed, for instance, the Disney movie for children, which you probably also know, or at least I know from my youth when I was a child. And there the Disney introduction song said, "Oh, I come from a land from faraway place where the caravans camel roam, where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home," right? So a savage place where people cut off ears and do horrendous things in this faraway desert and exotic at the same time place, as you could see in the imagery if you've watched the video. But yeah, you could see in all the Hollywood films, the Orientalist frames and on Muslims and the Arabic world, where you could see the male characters were often seen as irrational, emotional, and stupid, violent, oppressive of women, and constantly over-sexualized, or even rapists, corrupt, not modern. Right, from the Middle Ages, or terrorists who hate our freedoms. These are some of the most common frames in Hollywood movies of Muslims between that period. And I'm sure many of the movies, I don't know what the ratio is now, maybe it got a bit better or not, I don't know, or maybe even worse since then. But these are sort of the characters ascribed to the Muslims playing in Hollywood movies. And I think it's important to note that even before 9/11, this was why I was showing you, this was between the 19th century up until the year 2000, before 9/11 even happened, all these frames already existed that maybe got more dominant in normal media, but these imageries were of Arabic Muslim caricature were already much present in Western society as well. And we will later in this lecture see how some of these frames are then used in geopolitical developments, or the war on terror and against refugees, etc. So, but before we do this, I wanted to also delve into the history of imperialism and its alliances with militant forms and extremist forms of Islam, because often in the Western world, it is seen, right, in the clash of civilizations, the idea that the Western world and the Islamic world cannot, how you say, they're mutually exclusive. They will culminate in fight because the values are too different. But I think this is not an accurate analysis if you look at the alliances actually between more extreme forms of Islam and the Western world throughout history. And there are many, many examples, and I've listed here the few that I know some of. So this is in the First World War, for instance. As you know from previous classes, the Western world started mobilizing subjects in different colonies to fight with other powers. And during the First World War, the Germans, for instance, mobilized Arabic Muslims to fight the French and the British in the Middle East. And also the British and the French did the same, but then towards the Ottoman and the German Empire. And for instance, you could see during the First World War, the British would mainly form alliances with Saudi Arabia. I mean, it wasn't called Saudi Arabia back then, but with forces from that region would have a very monolithic view, or a very strict view of Islam, which is called Wahhabism specifically. And this Wahhabism basically was also a way of dividing and ruling this region, because the Ottoman Empire, of course, was also an Islamic empire, and within it you had different strands of Islam, and there was the idea of an ummah, of a unified Islamic world. And what the British did by liaising with this Wahhabism is also dividing Muslims more against each other, because the Wahhabis would say there's a very specific way of doing Islam, and otherwise you're doing it the wrong way. So this was also, in that sense, strategic to carve up the Ottoman Empire. And if you Google this divide and rule strategy, Arabic world, British Empire, you'll find literature around this. And later, another example of allying with a militant form of Islam was during the Second World War, where the Nazis also tried to mobilize Muslims against the British, the Russians, and the Americans, and the Jews. And there you could also see in the propaganda that they portrayed Islam as very male and warrior-like, and tried to put forward the elements of violence with it. And also later, during the Cold War, you could see, for instance, the United States, and this is a very known case as well now, that the United States supported the Mujahideen, which later became known as Al-Qaeda, but these extremist Muslim groups in Afghanistan, to fight against the communists there. This was in 1978, and there were literally billions of dollars put into there for training, arming, paying these groups. So this was a really huge proxy war. Proxy war meaning you don't fight between nations, but you fight your war from within an other foreign nation against other powers. This is an example, but also there's another example of Israel. For instance, Israel supported the Mujama I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Islamiyah, to counter the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. And basically this was done also in the 70s, because for Israel, the PLO was rising and getting more popular support in Palestine, which was a secular organization and also a communist, socialist, people's army, basically, and a liberation front of the Palestinian side. And they thought it would be a good strategy to counter this threat, let's say, by supporting more fundamentalist sides of Islam within Palestinian society. So this group, Israel supported, also set up schooling systems, Islamic universities in Gaza, for instance. And you could later see from this branch within the Gazan society, this is also the branch from which Hamas came out of. So just like, right, the US is now fighting often the Mujahideen, ISIS, which are also offshoots of this Afghan war and this network. Same, Israel created its own sort of Taliban, etc., by first having supported these extreme Islamic groups for their own interest. So also there you could see this liaison. And also, yeah, during in the recent war terror, this was more, let's say, in the war against dictators like Gaddafi, and against the dictatorship in Syria. You could see there in both cases, the US was also siding with rebel forces, which would also often be arming and training in these regions together with the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, extremist groups. So yeah, in all these cases, you can see there's a long trajectory and history of Western alliances, or either through other allies with Islamic extremism. And yeah, this relates as well to the more broader history of forming alliances with groups who are willing to commit violence if it fits your agenda. It can be a dictator or militant groups in Latin America, but also in the Middle East. These were the forces collaborating often with. So these are some examples. Yeah, so here you can see, for instance, Winston Churchill sitting with Saudi officials on the picture. And also here there was a picture on the left. You can see a picture that was taken around the First World War, where you see British officials with Saudi officials. Yeah, basically they were exchanging and giving subsidies and things like this, arming, training their forces to fight, for them to gain influence in the region. Yeah, and the other was example that I gave of the Second World War, where you saw Hitler and the Nazis trying to mobilize Islam in the Middle East for their purposes. You could, for instance, see Mein Kampf being translated in Arabic, but also anti-Semitic propaganda being disseminated in the Middle East as well, in which, the Jews were the forces of evil and things like this. And yeah, you could also see in the war in Afghanistan against communism, there was also much propaganda against communism disseminated there. But the United States also developed school textbooks for children, which maybe some of you don't know. But basically there were some US universities, and this was literally millions of dollars were spent into this. US universities designed children books in which they would basically pedagogically connect Islam to violence. And you can see here some fragments of the book. They learn about guns, or you see what is 3 guns, and you see knives in the images. And these were books that even when they stopped producing them, Al-Qaeda still was using these books for indoctrinating children. And I think there were like millions of these books printed, and they used to, basically these books were then disseminated in also refugee camps in, amongst other, Pakistan. But yeah, you can imagine the impact of this dissemination of these books in the region. And this was also done together with allies such as Saudi Arabia has always played an important role in these developments. And Nafis Ahmed, a researcher, also said in his book that as recently as 1999, US taxpayers paid the entire annual salary of every single Taliban government official. So up until that year, Taliban officials were also paid by US taxpayers' money, basically, for this illegal, I would say illegal, but for this wars. So this is also interesting with this whole class of civilization. Once you know this, it's a really strange concept, actually, because if you look at it from an anti-imperialist perspective, you can see that we have been the ones who we see as a threat have always been our biggest allies in the region to further our agendas. I mean, we've also fight against them in some cases. Against ISIS at some point it becomes an enemy, etc. But the reason that these groups exist has its history in our collaboration with them for geopolitical needs. And you can see while Saudi Arabia is always a very important factor of spreading these extremist ideologies, They are the biggest arms importers of the world, and I mean they don't get money from Russia or something. It's the Western powers giving them arms and money and buying their oil because it's our geopolitical ally. And so you could also see in the middle of the war on terror is still the Saudi Arabia would be able to buy huge imports of arms, and and this is also acknowledged by many Western policymakers like Joe Biden. Also admitted that their allies in the region were the ones also supporting extremist groups in both Libya and Syria, groups like al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, etc. So and this was of course because in Syria Assad is also an ally of Iran and Russia, so we're opposing them. So we basically are supporting an army, arming any group that would fight against this. So this is all part of geopolitics and getting control over the region's oil reserves, etc. And if you look at the framing, I mean, this is not discussed in public media, right? This is what is more discussed is the threat of terrorism, especially after 9/11 and Muslims. But yeah, under it is also this going on, which is less discussed in media. But yeah, you could see for these wars after 9/11 happened, the narratives and frames which were brought up by politicians to legitimize these wars were often about we have to bring democracy, right? There's corruption and dictatorship and basically a Middle East that is still behind and lacking, and they are saving basically. But also Orientalist tropes like that all the women there are oppressed and we need to save the women. For instance, you could see the Amnesty International example there of that says NATO keep the progress going with field women, like human rights for women and girls in Afghanistan. So we need to save these women there and go in there. And the funny thing is actually that women were very much emancipated in Afghanistan under communism. So the fact that they're being veiled and they have a worse position now in Afghanistan is because we supported these extremist groups, because they were much more emancipated than they are right now, and this was because of our alliation with these extremist groups. And you could see lies being spread like Gaddafi supplied troops with Viagra to encourage mass rape. So this idea, right, a savage dictator wanting to rape women. And this was of course proven to be false, that he was spreading Viagra, but these kind of things. And what was also interesting about this moment when the statue was taken down of Gaddafi, this is what the picture you see here. In the media, it's like an iconic moment that is remembered, right? The statue was taken down of Saddam Hussein, we liberated the country, etc. But if you look at the picture, if you zoom out of this more focused frame, you see nobody is on the square when it was happening. You just see a few American tanks circled in yellow. In red, you see a small crowd of people, and which are a combination of US soldiers, press, and Iraqis. And it was actually not the Iraqis who pulled it down, but an American truck was pulling it down. So basically, this was putting way, it was staged and frames as this huge, big event that everyone remembers. About the war on terror itself, I think if you look at the numbers and people killed in it, we have to ask who is the terrorist really in terms of damage. And if you look, for instance, at the Physicians for Social Responsibility, who won also a Nobel Peace Prize as a research group, they released a report in 2015 stating that by conservative estimates, the war, which they mean the war on terror, had directly or indirectly killed around 1 million people in Iraq, 220,000 in Afghanistan, and 80,000 in Pakistan. And then another report shows the number of American troops that died in, for instance, Iraq. It was about 7,000. I think this was in 2015 as well, or 2016. and I mean, the US government wants to protect US citizens, right? After 9/11, it's this big threat. That's why we have to go to all these foreign places. But if you look at the amount of deaths of, for instance, 9/11, that's like 3,000 people dead. So if you weigh the balance of this, is this really, what is the logic of this war? Is it really about saving lives, or whose lives are worth saving anyhow? Because if you look at the damage, it's so disproportionate. Also, the drone strikes, which have been institutionalized by now, are killing more people than 9/11. And yeah, this other figure on the right shows different estimates, because there's many different estimates of Iraqi deaths, but it's just not in proportion to what it tries to aim to save in the narrative. Then other statistics which can maybe help you think about so much talk about terrorism and the threat of Islamic terrorism. On the right side, you see a graph of the New America Foundation, which actually showed that since September 11, terrorist attacks by anti-government, racist, and other non-jihadist extremists have killed nearly twice as many people as those by Islamic jihadism. So you see that actually, if you look at just terror attack, it's often white supremacist or anti-government forces, twice as more than Muslim terrorists. Well, for the public imagery, it's always the Muslim terrorist who is the threat to public safety and everything. And in general, if you look at terrorism, for instance, in Europe, if you look at the top left graph, there you see the deaths by terrorist attack in Western Europe between 1970 and 2015. You see the number of attacks through terrorism is steadily declining over time. So basically, terrorism shouldn't be such a big topic these days as it is now. If you just look at the numbers, it's an irrational fear in that sense. And what you also see in Europe, most of the terrorist attacks have been by independence movements or leftist groups sometimes, or right-wing groups. So it's much more diverse than only Muslim groups. But this is a minority of the attacks are done by them. But in the imagery, this is really remembered and put forward every day. And if you look at the deaths of terrorism, like for who is terrorism actually a threat? Because the Western world, especially the US, says, okay, we need to go everywhere to fight terrorism for homeland security, right? For the security of the West. But if you look just at global deaths from terrorism, like who suffers from terrorist attacks most, you can see Western country. Well, there's one spike in 2001, which was 9/11. And for us, you can't even see it in the graph if you compare it to the number of deaths on terrorist attacks in other countries. Like Iraq is very high, you have Nigeria, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the rest of the world. But the Western world, even if terrorism was such a big problem, it's not even mostly our problem. So why are we going everywhere for protection of ourselves, right? And also what is an important element is that you could see that terrorist attacks are increasing after 2001 as well. And this is everything, right? You look at Iraq, for instance, the bottom graph. You can see the invasion was in 2003. And since 2003, you see an enormous increase of terrorism in Iraq, which is one of the hotspots now for this. And same goes for Afghanistan. You can see after the invasion of Afghanistan, you can see it rapidly rising. And the increase in terrorism has everything to do with also foreign occupation, destabilization of countries, because many of the terrorist explosions and attacks have also been against US troops, because these were local people resisting. And also, if you create a power vacuum, you see also groups starting to compete with each other. So this has everything to do also with destabilization. So also this has to be taken into account, that the foreign policy is also making terrorism increase as well, because it's such a destructive force in countries. Yeah, and also about the image of Muslims, I found this picture also interesting. We always equate Muslims in our imagery or memory to being Arabic, but if you look at the world's Muslim population, actually they are minority. Most are in the Asia Pacific and Sub-Sahara, so like more than 60% is Asian actually, and 15% is from Sub-Saharan Africa, and only about 20% is from the Middle East, actually. Yeah, and this basically, has to make you think about who is the terrorist here. And these are just images that were, spreading and in the news that people do remember about the US. And I mean, you have the Abu Ghraib prisons, of course, with torture prisons, and these were not, how you say, people often think, oh yeah, these were exceptional soldiers doing something wrong. They were individual racists in the army, but you have to realize that these Abu Ghraib prisons, there were multiple torture prisons. This was one that leaked images, but these torture techniques was not a way like of individuals bullying people. These techniques were developed at universities and very systematically applied to people. Different reports also said that the majority of these people in these prisons were just innocent. I think in Abu Ghraib there were 8,000 to 10,000 people within that prison where torture was very normal, and there were multiples of these prisons. So many people have been tortured by the US, and even in the same prisons where Saddam used to torture people as well. So it's just in that sense a mess, and you're becoming the one that you tried to save them from. I don't know. And also, the bombardments of just the capital city, but also the Iraqi infrastructure was lively broadcasted. Instead of it being seen as a horror, it was at the 8 o'clock news. Everyone could just chip in and see live how we were destroying a country. And also the lack of empathy towards what the damage that the Western world is doing there is just baffling. You could also see in one of the videos the interview with Madeleine Albright, right, when 500,000 Iraqi children had died, according to human rights reports, that Madeleine Albright just, when asked, was this worth the price? And she said, yes, it was worth the price. And these kind of things just show that, the West somehow cannot conceive themselves as terrorists. And the frame for going to Iraq was basically saying, okay, there were terrorists there, which were not there because the links are in Saudi Arabia, but we never invited Saudi Arabia because they are a strategic ally. Nuclear weapons, which was proved to be a lie, was a reason. And of course, freeing them from dictatorship. And the damage was just huge to the country after the invasion. You could see, as a consequence of the invasion, you had 4 million refugees, 3 million orphans, tens of thousands wounded, 8 million people in need of humanitarian aid. So about 1 million people dead, complete environmental disasters because of waste and pollution of bombs having been exploded that leave chemicals and even radioactive materials. An economic collapse, joblessness, everything collapsed there, the infrastructure, water and electricity systems, etc. And you had basically now a street view with systemic use of torture, house raids. Many houses have been kicked in by US soldiers, troops looking for terrorists, which were often also people just resisting aliens occupying their country, checkpoints, etc. So these were consequences for the country. And I wanted to just, there's much more on this to say, but just to give you an idea, okay, this could be seen as a form of terrorism, right? But if you look at Dutch newspapers, there was a researcher and historian, his name is Tayob Balcik, and he looked at the word terrorism in newspapers and was just checking, okay, when the word terrorism is used, what is it related to in newspapers? So these are the Telegraaf, the Volkskrant, the NRC, and Algemeen Dagblad you see here on the screen. These are the 4 biggest newspapers of the Netherlands. And he just read them all for 3 months long consistently, and would just put out the numbers, how many articles were about terrorism. So in the Telegraaf you had 102 articles on terrorism, Volkskrant 98, then you had another one 98 and 75. And you could see in the Telegraaf, which is seen as a right-wing media, of the 102, 101 were related to Muslim terrorism. Then the Volkskrant, of the 98, 80 were related to Muslim terrorism. And the other one was 98, 88, 75, 69. So basically, in all the Dutch newspapers, if you look at the average number is like you have in each of these papers, at least in every day, they write about terrorism in Dutch newspapers, or there's at least a message about terrorism. And for all of them, more than 90% of these messages related terrorism to Muslims. And none of these messages ever were about Western terrorism. So it's always the Muslim other groups. So there were some exception. 5 messages were of right-wing terrorism, and some were more independence groups like the PKK in Turkey. But yeah, so basically the Dutch newspapers are very much dominated by seeing the Muslim terrorist other as the terrorist. And you could also see he also mapped who were the writers of these articles in this period. And 84% of these people writing about Islamic terrorism were basically white men. And only about 3% were even Muslim, writing about Muslims. So it's mostly others writing about Muslims as well in Dutch newspapers, which maybe explain why it's so frequent. And another interesting graph you see here on the right is of Ewout Butter, who basically started to monitor the amount of news articles in Dutch newspapers seeing Islam as a threat to society. And you could see that since 2001, this really started to spark and rise in number. So there's an increased vision and narrative of the Islam threatening the West in Dutch newspapers. So this was of the 5 biggest Dutch newspapers since 2001. So you can clearly see how the media narrative has been changing since 2001. And that there's a monopoly basically on Muslims being terrorists in Dutch newspapers can also be seen by this instance, which I spotted last year. You cannot read it because it's in Dutch, so I'll explain. You don't have to read the words. But basically, there was an attack, and a terrorist attack of a man who drove with a car in Germany just into people on a square. And then they said, we have to correct this article. It was not a terrorist attack. And in the explanation of the correction, they said the following. In first instance, the German newspapers said it was a terrorist attack, but by now people have said that the culprit was a German without a migration background, meaning we had to reformulate our article because saying it was a terror attack was not appropriate. And this has been corrected after 30 minutes. So this was our national Dutch newspaper, saying basically, first it had an article saying it was a terrorist attack, and then it corrected that article and said, no, it was not a terrorist attack because it was a German and not someone with a migration background. So that's just baffling, a baffling example of how you can see why this monopoly on Muslim and terrorism is there in newspaper. It's just, there. And you could see this also in the image. You know, we talked about commemoration as well in the Dutch around 4th and 5th of May. And there you can see this idea of clash of civilization also happening in videos about freedom and Liberation Day. You could see videos who said we need to have solidarity with victims of the Second World War, but also of terrorist attack. And then they had the Charlie Hebdo images there, and they said we need to protect our freedom of speech and expression, and and also some military, putting Dutch military also in positive light, protecting us. But yeah, these show, and in these videos there was no empathy or nothing shown about the victims of the war on terror, right? So there also you can see this one-sided, who's worth remembering, which victims are worthy, right? Like the Nafis Ahmed article you had to read of unworthy victims, like the millions of people who died in the Middle East through Western interventions and everything, or interventions. They're no being, it's just not part of discourse, or there's double standards on whose lives matter in this regard. And about this, so that I wanted to tell on the war on terror and putting things in perspective. What I want to do for this section now is tell more about a new kind of politics emerging in the Netherlands also since 9/11, which is a new kind of right-wing politics, populism, you could say. Basically, to put it very simply, the Trumps of the Netherlands, let's say. You have three very important politicians. One of them died and got killed, but was very famous, is Pim Fortuyn. But basically they were breaking the taboo of being allowed to talk about others in terms of race, because what they saw as tensions were growing in Dutch society, they were saying, okay, why are we not allowed to name the problem as it is? Because the problems are these immigrants, right? And the Muslim threat, etc. Because as you know and learned after the Second World War, there was a huge, right? Racism is bad. We can't do race anymore. And this whole colorblind discourse came. But this specific political branch, this populist political branch in the Netherlands, is now saying we should break the taboo on not being allowed to mention race because Muslims are threat, and we dare to say as it is. And that's basically part of their rhetoric. And other elements, I've made like a small sum of elements of their political ideology, but basically they say there's too much bureaucracy and the system is corrupt and it does not serve the people and we need to protest against it. So it's also basically a reaction of all the the neoliberal budget cuts that have been there on healthcare, etc. So they are also, it also stems from that dissatisfaction of the system not working for the people, and they say now we will serve the people, and they mean Dutch people, not others, and that the elite is keeping things from themselves, but then also the threat of immigrants coming here for free money. Belastingtrekkers is a Dutch saying, sort of, in that sense, like they just come here for the social benefits and they don't want to work, they are lazy, etc., criminals, or dangerous for women, etc. And they don't allow free speech when we talk about Muslims. So basically, the Dutch values need to be protected. So this is their, in a small sum, the thing that links these political parties. And you could see this really changed the narrative in Dutch politics and elections, because beforehand it was not normal to do so much with racism in a negative way as politicians. This explicitly after the Second World War, this was not seen as normal. But now you can see the spectrum of the debate is getting more and more shifting to the right, right extremism and racism. For instance, I let you watch a video by the Party of the Freedom, which is one of the three extreme group of Geert Wilders, which is in the middle here, basically saying, it was just a horror video basically of Islam is the threat, etc. And this was broadcasted by television. I mean, this was really a shock at that day, at least for Muslim communities, especially in the Netherlands, when this was broadcast on television. Like, many children at school didn't feel safe. They were like, how is this, being broadcasted on Dutch television? but you can also see at stemwijzer, so these are basically stemwijzers, like an organization, neutral organization, that helps you choose a party on which you want to vote. So they give you 20 or 25 questions you need to answer, and then they give you voting advice based on this, because we don't have two-party vote system. We have like 16 parties or something. It's much more dispersed in the Netherlands. So you have these kind of websites that help you to choose your political party of preference if you're not sure yourself. And in these questions of this of the biggest website which is doing this, there were, for instance, 3 examples. So of the 25 questions, or 28 or 30, there were 3 questions on Muslims as well, which I found very problematic. They were just in there to help you, who do you want to vote on? So one question which was there was Islamic migrants, because this was part of the political debate. Should we allow Islamic migrants? So then the question was, shouldn't the Netherlands close their borders for Islamic migrants? Then another question said Salafistic organizations. It asked, are Salafistic organizations allowed to get subsidies for municipalities? And another question was, should Amsterdam allow new mosques or not? So these are just really putting Muslims apart, questions specifically only for Muslims in the elections. And you could see the result of the facilities around elections as well. And another campaign, for instance, by the VVD, which is a center-right party, but not seen as far-right, said that Nederland moet Nederland blijven, Dutch should stay Dutch, and our values should be protected, and normaal doen was their slogan, like you should act normal, or Dutch in other words. And there was a whole letter written by our prime minister saying, okay, we need to protect our Dutch values, and people are not behaving, etc. But this was really, if it's not explicitly against Muslims, everyone knew who he was talking about with these slogans and these campaigns. And these are just other examples, but some people in the second House of Chambers just asking, okay, we should withdraw subsidy for Islamic schools, but allow it for Christian schools. Really, like, just this double policies, like explicitly targeting Islam and Muslims, but not on the same standards as other religions. Or there was also a ban on passports, for instance, that if you as a Muslim would go to Syria to battle, that they would withdraw your passports. These were all kinds of conversations happening in Dutch politics. And this thing of having Islam and the other so much by these populist parties constantly trying to shift public discourse more and more to the right. You could also see the left-wing parties starting to be part of these racist discourses as well, where you, for instance, here you see 3 in 2002, 2008, 2011. These were from the PvdA, which is a Labour party that is considered left in the Dutch. They said, for instance, things like Moroccans have a monopoly on violence, or we need to humiliate Moroccans to teach them values, or the other one said we have kut Marokkanen, yes, typical Dutch scheldwoord, but it basically says like these are we have asshole Moroccans, basically. So you could also see it's not only the far right, it's also centrum parties and left-wing parties that start to integrate these racist discourses in their in their way of talking about issues. So in that sense, you could see racism was really starting to get normalized again in Dutch public debate. And from this, I mean, of course, from the Muslim community, you see now many responses and people starting to organize. And one example which an organization that was created about 1.5-2 years ago around the burqa ban. So basically in the Netherlands, it's now forbidden to wear a hijab or a burqa. So, and they started to say like, hey, what's happening? We are losing our freedom of what we are allowed to wear. And they're called Speak, and there's, I think, 50 or 60 Muslim women part of this organization, and they say, ik ben niet your strijdtoneel on the banner on the left, and that means I am not your battleground, because they were also critiquing as women, like, hey, other peoples are telling we are oppressed and now telling us what we are able to wear, speaking on our behalf, not asking us. So overriding them. And you could also see them critiquing white feminism that was saying, you know, feminism should be a certain way. So there you could see that they have a different view of what women's liberation looks like, and also from an Islamic perspective. Yeah, they basically wanted to be respected and be able to wear what they would want to wear. And another organization that you could see that was also specifically made was Maruf, which is a queer Muslim organization. And there you could also see they organize specifically from a place where you are both queer and Muslim, so you have like a double form of discrimination or difficulty, because you might have difficulty being queer in your own Muslim community, but also difficult to be queer in the queer community because you have a Muslim background and there's racism against Muslims. So they needed their own space and organization. And I know the director of this organization also said that the Dutch media would often approach him to say things, how there was this queer phobia in his Muslim community, but he said at some point he stopped participating in this because he was not allowed to, you know, reflect on other things as well. So he didn't want to be the sort of guy constantly negatively portraying the Muslim as intolerant and different from Western society, because Western society itself is also very homophobic. I think with the homo nationalism you heard of last presentation, critiquing a lot this as well. But yeah, so you can really see also on the institutional side, it's getting more and more extreme in the Dutch context. So the burqa ban, of which the UN rapporteur also said that this reflects the wider consolidation of Islamophobia in the Netherlands. And yeah, this is also really much seen currently. Like this year, you also have, I think every month again, like a debate on Islamic schools, what are they teaching, etc. And there's just such a disproportionate focus on Muslims in the Netherlands. And you could also see it after the Paris attacks that a lot of Muslims were asked to apologize or say something on behalf of Islam. Well, this is an absolute, ridiculous thing to ask. But yeah, so about intersectionality also, which was part of this week's reading. If it's a new concept or term for you, basically intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and this was done because in a court case she observed that it was not because discrimination is not allowed, but in a court case she observed that from the position of a Black woman it was difficult to identify what exactly was the kind of discrimination happening, because you could be both discriminated for being a woman or for your racial background. So in that sense, there's like a double crossroad. That's why it's from the word intersectionality. You're at the crossroad, and so in that sense, the total can be more complicated than the individual discrimination, and you need to look at it as a whole. But beyond race and gender, of course, there's many other dimensions, as you could see here in the visualization of this. There's also the religion aspect of the Muslim women example that I gave. but also your nationality, if you have a migration background, then maybe language barriers, all these kind of things can be taken into account. And what you also see, if you look with an intersectional lens also at activism and where groups are formed, you can see that people are organizing from intersectional identities. For instance, there's also Black, Queer and Trans Resistance Netherlands, which basically from a Black and queer identity perspective are started to organize. Why? Because they felt both discrimination inside the Black community as inside the white queer community. So they needed their own space to work and put things on the agenda from there. Yeah, so that's, I guess, in a nutshell, what intersectionality is also about. And I think in the readings you had to read, there was also more examples given from a legal perspective of what this means. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the readings of this week. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussions, but also the coming presentations of you all. All right.